When people discuss the Inflation Reduction Act, the conversation usually turns to tax credits, eligibility rules, and compliance details. But those details are not what fundamentally shape market outcomes. What matters is how incentives change behavior across an entire system. In this episode, we're not going to explain the IRA line by line. We're going to look at what actually happens in the market. Specifically, why small distributed energy assets consistently scale faster than large centralized alternatives under the same policy environment. This is about outcomes, not intent, not ideology, and not paperwork. Most IRA discussions stay focused on mechanics, which credits apply, who qualifies, and how compliance works. That framing misses the point. Incentives don't just change project economics, they shape deployment patterns. They influence who can move, how quickly they can act, and how much uncertainty they can tolerate. This analysis looks beyond policy documents and focuses on observable results. When you do that, a clear pattern emerges. Distributed assets consistently scale faster than centralized ones, not because the policy says so, but because the system responds that way. Incentives are usually interpreted in three simple ways. First, they lower upfront costs. Second, they improve returns on investment. Third, they attract more capital into the sector. All of that is partially true, but it's incomplete, because incentives don't just improve economics, they change behavior. They determine who acts first, who can act repeatedly, and who can move even when conditions aren't perfect. Those effects matter more than marginal changes in ROI. Every incentive system quietly answers three questions: who can act easily, who can act repeatedly, and who bears the least risk while acting. The IRA never explicitly says favor distributed assets, but when you observe deployment velocity and market response, a consistent pattern appears. Certain asset structures respond faster and more reliably to incentives than others. That's not policy intent, that's system behavior, and that distinction matters. When we look at real deployment data, four patterns stand out. First, distributed projects move faster from planning to operation. Second, participation broadens. More players enter the market. Third, scaling happens incrementally through repetition. And fourth, coordination burdens are lower. These are not theoretical projections. They show up in project pipelines, capital flows, and real installations. The incentives didn't mandate these outcomes. They enabled them. Small distributed assets move faster for structural reasons. They require fewer simultaneous approvals. They tolerate uncertainty better. And they scale through repetition rather than orchestration. Incentives reduce friction most effectively where friction is already fragmented. That's why distributed assets respond quickly under incentive pressure. This isn't a design philosophy or a recommendation. It's an observable outcome of how different asset structures behave under the same rules. Another underappreciated effect of incentives is risk redistribution. Large projects concentrate risk into single, high-stakes decisions with long exposure windows. Small projects distribute risk across many lower-stakes deployments. When incentives reduce downside exposure, participants become more willing to act repeatedly. You can see this in who enters the market, how often projects repeat, and how resilient deployment is to delays. Incentives don't remove risk. They change how it's carried. Precision matters here. This is not a political argument, and it's not a moral one. Incentives don't express preferences. They produce behaviors. The IRA could have been written by any administration. The observable outcome would be the same. Asset types capable of responding incrementally and under uncertainty move first. That's a structural effect driven by system dynamics, not ideology. Large, centralized projects face different constraints. They require coordination across utilities, regulators, off-takers, and communities. They operate on multi-year timelines, and they have single points of failure midstream. Even generous incentives can't eliminate these constraints. So the same policy environment produces very different outcomes depending on asset architecture. That divergence is the signal. For founders and investors, mastering policy language matters less than observing behavior. Pay attention to deployment cadence, participation breadth, and sensitivity to delay. Which strategies keep moving under uncertainty? Those observable patterns tell you what incentives actually reward in practice, far more clearly than any policy summary. A common mistake is interpreting these outcomes as favoritism. They're not. They're feedback. Incentives apply pressure. Structures respond differently. Movement reveals capacity. Distributed assets move first, not because they're preferred, but because they can move. That's the difference. This is why distributed energy resources, including residential VPPs, continue scaling under the IRA, not because of a single credit, but because incentives reward repeatable action under uncertainty. VPPs aggregate small assets. Each unit deploys independently. Risk distributes across the portfolio. This episode explains what happens under incentive systems. It does not explain how to engineer responses. That distinction matters. There is a deeper analytical layer behind these outcomes. It explains why certain asset structures consistently benefit under incentive pressure. But that analysis is proprietary. Once you understand the underlying mechanisms, you stop asking surface questions. And that's exactly where we stop. TaBIS focuses on strategy differentiation, systems-level analysis, and capital allocation edge. We study why some VPP approaches compound over time, while others stall, even with strong early numbers. These are layers traditional models consistently miss. If you're building or allocating capital in this space, this lens matters more than any single forecast. See you next time.